Today, when Rachel Reeves presented her spring budget, her words caused quite a stir. The aim was to convince Britons that she would help the economy recover, and the country recover from the crisis. But as soon as she finished her speech, it didn't take long for the opposition to react, and its claims were stark. Beneath that plausible name of spring budget were decisions that only exacerbate already existing economic problems and call into question the effectiveness of existing policies. The budget, which was supposed to be a symbol of a new economic course, turned out to be just another step towards further instability. The opposition immediately criticized the announced measures, saying that instead of the promised stabilization, Reeves only adds dysfunctional economic tools that are unlikely to help the country out of the crisis. From the very beginning of her speech, Reeves tried to demonstrate how her budget could bring back economic stability by reducing default risks and guaranteeing growth. All she succeeded in doing, however, was to stoke public doubt. In her eagerness to show that her plan would provide stability, Reeves failed to mention the fact that the election she was referring to would take place in an environment of high inflation, rising unemployment, and negative forecasts from the world's biggest financial institutions. And in these moments, when it would seem that the country should be striving for fiscal consolidation and a stronger domestic market, the budget has become a symbol of instability. The accusations from political opponents have been particularly vociferous and have begun to hit on all fronts. The Shadow Chancellor, for example, was not afraid to call everything that was happening a catastrophe. She sharply criticized both the budget itself and its drafting, saying that the situation in the country at the moment is only getting worse, and the main goal of Reeves is to mask her own mistakes under the veil of promises. The opposition recalled that if unpopular decisions related to tax increases as well as cuts in the social sector had not been taken, perhaps the situation would have been different. All of these steps, Reeves insisted, ultimately only resulted in negative consequences for citizens. And most importantly, these actions simply failed to bring economic stability back to the country. Of course, in words, Reeves presented her budget as a step towards overcoming financial difficulties, but practice has shown that not everything is so rosy. It is not by chance that she emphasized that her budget would necessarily lead to growth, but in reality, according to experts, it only creates additional economic risks. The country's political life in recent years has resembled a seesaw. Rising taxes and rising healthcare and social security costs have only exacerbated the problem. Instead of giving businesses and citizens room to recover, the government has increasingly reduced the room for maneuver in an attempt to balance the budget, with negative results. More important, however, was not only what was said in Reeves' speech, but also how the opposition reacted to her words. Instead of responding to the government's proposals, the Shadow Chancellor, who was to play the role of chief opponent, challenged the proposed budget with all the passion in the world, insisting that the Reeves government had gone down the wrong path in its actions. This political battle, tough and merciless, exposed all the weaknesses of the current economy. Of all the measures announced, none was capable of meeting expectations, and instead of moving towards recovery, the budget was a confirmation that the government does not know how to learn from its mistakes. The opposition made it clear that Reeves' policies were not the solution, but another wave of uncertainty that she would bring to the economy, and the challenge to that was addressed right to her face. When Reeves was announcing measures to reduce inflation and increase government revenue, in reality she risked losing the trust of people who have long understood that stability can only be the result of long-term, sound economic decisions. It wasn't just about raising taxes on the rich or corporate taxes, but laws that were designed to support the private sector. Against a backdrop of rising unemployment and declining consumer spending, such moves look not like a return to economic stability, but a path into the unknown. Under these circumstances, many have begun to wonder, what will such a decision bring to the country, other than making things even worse for citizens? The accusations made by the Shadow Chancellor in response to Reeves' plans were not just a political challenge. It was a signal that there is a moment of truth in Britain when decisions need to be made, rather than simply promising what they cannot deliver. For the government itself, it was another blow to its reputation, and the whole situation changed in a moment into a political trend that will determine how events unfold next. When the Shadow Chancellor began to dismantle Rachel Reeves' statements in her response speech, there was not only determination in her voice, but a caustic criticism directed at the whole course of the government. Her every word was undermined by facts that showed that Reeves had failed to address the problems she herself had created. Beginning with a rebuke on inflation management, the Shadow Chancellor said the government was failing to do a good job of controlling price rises, and this was primarily because economic policy did not take into account the real risks to businesses and the public. Since the last budget until today, the country's inflation rate has doubled compared to the forecasts that were made when Reeves came to power. This has resulted in the public's purchasing power being significantly reduced and businesses, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, being threatened with total collapse. Reeves is not only failing to control inflation but is leading the country into economic stagnation, the Shadow Chancellor said. She added that the plan proposed by Reeves failed to take into account that economic growth is directly dependent on the stability of small businesses and investor confidence. And while the minister has tried to contain panic by saying that the situation will improve in the future, the reality is that without strong support for entrepreneurs and a reduction in the tax burden on small companies, the country will face an even greater wave of redundancies and bankruptcies. It is important to note that Reeves made the decision to impose additional income taxes on large corporations and increase the tax burden on small businesses. This decision not only worsened the financial situation, but also dealt a serious blow to businesses already struggling to recover from the pandemic and global economic problems. However, the Shadow Chancellor's criticism was not limited to rising inflation and tax policy. She lashed out with particular fury at the so-called external threat that Reeves constantly mentions in her speeches. The Reeves-led Treasury often points to external factors, such as the effects of the war in Ukraine or global economic crisis, as causes of instability. The Shadow Chancellor sarcastically remarked that in fact the current situation is solely to blame for poor economic decision-making at home. Saying that it is only the fault of external factors is like blaming the storm for not taking shelter in the rain, she declared. The Shadow Chancellor was particularly scathing in noting that Reeves is willing to blame everyone, including President Putin, for the economic woes, but never takes responsibility for her own mistakes. She emphasized that it is her decisions regarding the wrong budget policies as well as inefficient allocation of funds that are the reason why the British economy continues to drift towards crisis. How long will the government hide behind other people's backs instead of admitting its mistakes? She asked. Indeed, if Reeves had paid more attention to domestic economic problems, such as excessive spending and inefficient use of tax revenues, she might have made more progress on the economy. But as the Shadow Chancellor's speech made clear, the government chose to shift the blame to external circumstances rather than actually work on reform. The next blow dealt by the Shadow Chancellor was on the issue of social care and health. In her speech, Reeves tried to convince the public that she would cut spending on health and other critical social care areas, which would lead to a balanced budget in the future. However, opponents, particularly from the Shadow Cabinet, could not agree with this approach. They pointed out that cutting spending on social services and health in the face of the global crisis was not only unwise but immoral. Against a backdrop of rising sickness rates, as well as an increasing number of unemployed people, such measures, the Shadow Chancellor said, could lead to catastrophic consequences that would cost far more in the future than today's problems. Criticism was also directed at the fact that in her budget Reeves did not offer proper support for businesses, especially small businesses. On the contrary, she planned to increase taxes on entrepreneurs, which would have significantly worsened the financial situation of small and medium-sized businesses in the country. Is a tax on small businesses really the way for the government to improve the economy? The Shadow Chancellor asked. In turn, the opposition argued that without strong support and development of the small business sector, which is the backbone of the economy, the country will not be able to recover from the crisis. Tensions in the labor market and worsening unemployment are all consequences of the economic policies that Reeves is pursuing, her opponents added. In response, Reeves tried to assure Britons that her plan would eventually lead to economic growth, but such loud promises did not seem to resonate. The Shadow Chancellor's speech was not just a response, but a real political battle in which she demanded real action from the government, not words. The question was not who would blame whom for the economic crisis, but what to do to fix the situation. In the fierce political debate that erupted after Rachel Reeves' spring budget presentation, it became apparent that none of her proposed measures were able to convince the public and economists of their effectiveness. In response to her statements, the political opposition not only harshly criticized the proposed changes, but also asked questions that questioned not only the very structure of the budget, but also its long-term sustainability. One of the most prominent points was the criticism of Reeves for her failure to take into account the real needs of business, as well as the lack of a clear strategy for dealing with the economic crisis. The focus was on the growing tax burden and measures to cut spending in social areas. The Shadow Chancellor, who easily defeated the government's proposals, emphasized that higher taxes, especially on small and medium-sized enterprises, would lead not only to job destruction, but also to a complete loss of confidence among businessmen. Above all, the criticism centered on the proposed tax hike for companies, which will directly hit small businesses. Small and medium-sized companies, which form the backbone of the British economy, have already faced major challenges in recent years, including the effects of the pandemic and global economic instability. With rising inflation and unstable demand for goods and services, raising taxes would be the final nail in the coffin for many of them. The solutions proposed by the government take absolutely no account of reality, the Shadow Chancellor said. She emphasized that with small businesses on the brink of bankruptcy, taxes as an additional burden would only accelerate the economic downturn. Instead of creating incentives for these companies to grow and develop, the government is instead making them vulnerable to external shocks and long-term economic instability. In addition to this, the issue of job support was no less pressing. In a country where unemployment is already rising, a tax increase, especially on job-creating businesses, is a suicidal move for the economy. The Shadow Chancellor also sarcastically pointed out that Reeves, in his budget, not only offers no real steps to restore jobs, but completely ignores the problem of rising unemployment in the country. Once again, the government has offered no workable measures to create the conditions for long-term job growth. Instead, only systematic cuts in social spending had been proposed, which, according to the opposition, would only lead to increased social tensions and protests among the population. She emphasized that, in the context of rising unemployment, it was necessary, on the contrary, to increase investment in job creation, especially in sectors such as health and education, where there were sharp budget cuts. In this context, the Shadow Chancellor said, "We can only expect the situation to worsen." However, the most important thing about the Shadow Chancellor's speech was her attitude to the long-term consequences of Reeves' budget measures. Calling for more responsible and forward-thinking decisions, she said that the vector set by this budget could lead to dire consequences for future generations. Intervening in the economy by increasing taxes and cutting social programs is unlikely to bear quick fruit. On the contrary, such measures may further worsen the situation of those segments of the population that are already experiencing hardship. While the government claims to be committed to stability, the actual steps show the opposite. The number of people in the country who feel the effects of economic instability is growing every day. Concluding her speech, the Shadow Chancellor moved on to social policy, where she again criticized the government's actions. She expressed concern that the proposed measures to cut social spending would not only fail to address the budget deficit, but would also increase social inequality. Reducing support for vulnerable groups such as pensioners, people with disabilities and large families is unacceptable at a time when the country is struggling with an economic downturn. Instead of investing in infrastructure, job creation and long-term social programs, the government has chosen the path of short-term austerity, which, according to the opposition, will cost even more in the future to restore the economy and social stability. The government, according to the Shadow Chancellor, should instead have focused on creating the conditions for stable and sustainable growth, investing in education programs that will help train skilled workers for the market, and developing sectors that can create jobs. In the long run, such measures will help reduce the burden on social services and also improve the quality of life of citizens. Unfortunately, the budget proposed by Reeves left all these problems unaddressed, which the opposition claims is the government's biggest mistake. The problems with the budget that the Shadow Chancellor talked about only highlighted the government's overall unfulfilled plan. Talks about cuts to health and other social spending have provoked strong reactions in the public, as they have directly affected vital sectors for citizens. In an attempt to cope with long-term economic instability, the government has outlined short-term austerity policies that will ultimately provide neither stability nor growth in the future.